quiet of the evening was shattered by a sound that chilled the very air in the small Parisian apartment. It was the shrill cry of a woman, followed by a sharp silence, then the sound of hurried footsteps, retreating. In an instant, the once tranquil residence on Rue de l'Étoile had become a crime scene. Detective Hercule Poirot, freshly arrived in Paris after a case in London, had been quietly enjoying his evening when he received a phone call that would soon alter the course of his night. His manner, calm as ever, betrayed no sign of the urgency he was about to face. "Mon ami, you must come quickly. It is a mystery most baffling." Inspector Dubois' voice crackled over the line. Poirot, ever composed, glanced at his watch, nodded and adjusted the crisp collar of his jacket. "I shall be there at once. Leave no stone unturned, mon ami." The apartment, a cosy but elegant affair on the 4th floor of a grand old building, looked ordinary enough from the outside. Yet inside, the air was thick with tension. As Poirot entered the scene, he was greeted by the solemn faces of the police, the flashing of cameras, and the disarray of a place once filled with laughter. A single figure, a woman in her early 30s, lay dead on the floor of the sitting room, her lifeless eyes staring toward the ceiling. The faintest trace of blood stained her elegant white gown. A red glove, scarlet in hue and nearly as striking as her own beauty, lay delicately upon her outstretched hand, as though it had been carefully placed. Poirot stood still for a moment, taking in every detail. There were no signs of a struggle. The door had been locked from the inside. There were no windows open, no evidence of forced entry. No weapon had been found nearby, and yet here she was, dead, her life seemingly extinguished in an otherwise peaceful setting. Inspector Dubois, his face taut with frustration, approached Poirot, his voice low. "There is something strange about this case, Poirot. The glove. It was found here, by her side. The woman was renowned in society, but no one seems to have any clue who would want to harm her. All we know is her name, Catherine Lefebvre. A woman of wealth, grace and charm." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me, Inspector, what exactly was she doing here alone?" Dubois seemed unsure. "That's the odd part. She was hosting a small gathering earlier that evening, but as the night wore on, her guests left. She was last seen by the butler, Monsieur Gerard, who claims she was simply reading by the fire before he retired for the night. It was not until this morning that her body was discovered. And the glove. No one knows where it came from. It was not hers." Poirot's gaze lingered on the glove, the color of which seemed to mock the very life it had once clung to. He crouched down next to the body, examining it from a different angle. "The glove," he murmured, almost to himself. "It is the most curious. Of clues, no, it speaks to us, but what is it saying?" Poirot stood up with deliberate care, casting his sharp eyes around the room. Everything was still and quiet, the usual chaos of a crime scene absent here. Everything appeared to be in order, too much so, as if it had been staged. "Why no signs of violence?" Poirot mused aloud. "A murder without a mark upon the victim. That is most intriguing." "Maybe she died from poisoning," Dubois suggested, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. Poirot shook his head, looking back down at the Scarlet Glove. "Perhaps, but the absence of a struggle suggests something more subtle. No, she did not fight. She did not cry out. But this glove, there is a message here. A symbol, perhaps. A carefully chosen object. It does not belong to her." Poirot's thoughts raced as he considered the possibilities. Catherine Lefebvre had been a well-respected figure in high society. She had recently made waves with her charitable works and was known to entertain often. Yet there had been rumors, whispers of a past she kept hidden. Could someone from that past have returned to claim vengeance? His eyes flickered over the rest of the room. A faint trace of perfume lingered in the air, a familiar scent, one that stirred a distant memory. The fireplace was cold, its embers long since died. The last embers of a flame extinguished, perhaps just as Catherine had been. Poirot's sharp gaze fell upon a small desk in the corner of the room. It was neat, perhaps too neat for someone who had been engaged in an evening of socializing. A letter lay open on the desk, its contents hidden from view. He stepped over to it, his fingers brushing the paper as he read the few words scrawled in hasty handwriting. "Your future is as red as the glove." The message struck Poirot like a blow, his mind immediately piecing together the strange words. "Mon Dieu," he muttered under his breath. This was no ordinary crime. The glove, now even more mysterious, was no longer just a clue. It was a warning. Someone had intended for the message to be clear, and for Poirot to understand it. "Inspector," Poirot said, his voice even and calm, yet his mind sharp as ever, "I believe we are dealing with a riddle. And the answer is closer than we think." Dubois frowned, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean?" Poirot looked at him, a slight smile curling the edges of his lips. "It is simple, mon ami. The glove. It is not the key. It is the symbol of the key. The mystery lies in the past of Madame Lefebvre, a past she sought to bury." "Her past?" Dubois repeated, confused. Poirot nodded. "Indeed, we must find out who knew her well enough to send such a personal message. Someone wanted to remind her of something she had forgotten. Or perhaps something she had been trying to escape." Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room once more. There was more to this crime than met the eye. The Scarlet Glove was only the beginning of an enigma far deeper than anyone could have imagined, and Poirot would not rest until it was solved. Poirot's gaze did not leave the room, his mind moving at a pace far quicker than anyone else could follow. The police, well-meaning though they were still fixated on the surface of things, checking for fingerprints, questioning the butler and the few guests who remained after the evening's festivities. They seemed to be following the routine, steps of any investigation, moving methodically from one possibility to the next. But Poirot was already seeing past all of that, his mind weaving through a tapestry of clues, each one fragile, yet pointing him toward something deeper, something more elusive. As he watched Inspector Dubois and his men search the apartment, Poirot's sharp eyes picked up the smallest of details, details that no one else seemed to notice. He moved slowly around the room, deliberately ignoring the obvious questions they were chasing, focusing instead on the subtleties that most would dismiss. He crossed to the fireplace, where the faintest traces of soot had been disturbed, as though something, or someone, had been handled near the hearth. Poirot bent down and gently brushed his fingers over the edge of the mantelpiece. It was a subtle shift, one that might have gone unnoticed if not for the angle of the light and the delicate dusting that had gathered. "Mon Dieu," he whispered to himself, "a hidden hand has touched here." He stood up, his mind already working through the possibilities. From the corner of the room the sound of footsteps drew his attention. It was the butler, Monsieur Gérard, still visibly shaken by the events. Poirot knew that this man, with his refined posture and impeccable manners, would not be easily deceived. But something about his behavior struck Poirot as odd. There was a nervous twitch in Gerard's right hand, which seemed to tighten around the doorknob before he released it. Poirot's mind raced. This wasn't just the behavior of a man who had discovered a murder. This was the reaction of someone who had seen or heard something they weren't willing to admit. "Monsieur Gerard," Poirot called, his voice smooth and assured. "You were the last person to see Madame Lefebvre alive, yes?" Gerard stiffened, then turned slowly, his expression composed but for the briefest moment of hesitation. "That is correct, Monsieur Poirot. She was simply reading by the fire, as I said before. She seemed quite well." "And you retired for the night shortly after, leaving her alone?" "Yes," Gerard replied, though his eyes flickered toward the fireplace as though he too noticed the subtle disturbance that Poirot had already observed. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "It is strange, is it not, Monsieur Gerard, that in a room so small one can hear almost every sound, yet no one heard anything amiss?" Gerard blinked, then nodded with a slight nervousness that did not escape Poirot's notice. "No, Monsieur Poirot. There was nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot's gaze sharpened, catching the fleeting discomfort in Gerard's eyes. He would revisit the butler later, but for now, there was something more pressing. As Poirot turned back toward the center of the room, his eyes fell upon the small desk again. The letter, with its cryptic message, had already been examined by the police, but there was something about it that nagged at him. He moved closer and carefully inspected the paper, noting the hurried scribbles. The ink was smudged slightly in places, as if the writer had been interrupted, yet there was no sign of disturbance in the rest of the room that could explain such haste. He flipped the paper over, revealing something that had been missed entirely by the police, a small, almost imperceptible ink stain on the back, as if the writer had pressed the pen too hard in a moment of frustration. The ink was fresh, not dried. This was not the work of someone calmly writing a letter, but someone agitated, who had quickly jotted down a message without concern for neatness. The smudge had not gone unnoticed by the authorities, but they had assumed it to be a trivial detail. Poirot, however, saw it for what it was. Something had happened in the moments before the letter had been finished. The writer had been disturbed, likely by the sound of something in the room, something that had made them rush to complete their task. His next thought was to search the surrounding area for anything that might explain the letter's urgent tone. He examined the drawer where Catherine had kept her correspondence, but when he opened it, he found it curiously empty, save for a small leather-bound notebook. Inside were the names of various benefactors and notes on charitable events, but nothing that could connect directly to the mystery. Poirot turned the pages slowly, his fingers brushing over the names and dates, but there was no immediate link to the events of the night. He paused, the smallest of smiles curving at the corners of his lips. The emptiness of the drawer told him more than any clue. Someone had taken something from this room, something that had not been found. Poirot stepped back and gestured for Dubois to join him. "Inspector, I believe we are overlooking something rather crucial." Dubois, who had been inspecting the body once more, looked up, clearly frustrated. "What is it now, Poirot?" "There is something in this room that should not be here," Poirot replied, his eyes scanning the area once again. "You see, The only way to make sense of this crime is to understand what was taken before it was completed. Dubois frowned, glancing around the room as though the solution might reveal itself. Taken? But the woman was alone. What could have been taken? Poirot smiled, though it was a small, knowing smile. Ah, my dear friend, you see, this crime was not a random act of violence, it was an act of precision. Someone knew exactly where to look and where not to. Poirot then turned to the butler, who was standing quietly at the edge of the room, seemingly distracted by his own thoughts. "Monsieur Gérard," Poirot began, his tone sharp, "I believe you might have seen something more than you are letting on." The butler's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since Poirot had arrived, a flash of something, fear perhaps, crossed his face. Poirot's gaze fixed upon him, and he spoke with quiet authority. "You know what was taken, Monsieur Gérard, and I believe you know exactly who was responsible for this most tragic and curious death." The butler took a small, involuntary step backward, his posture stiffening. Poirot had found his first deception, and with it the first thread of the tangled mystery that was Catherine Lefebvre's death. Poirot's mind was already working at full speed as he observed the subtle unease in Gérard's eyes. The butler's reaction had been revealing, but the time for direct confrontation had not yet come. Instead, he turned his attention to the others who had been present at the scene, ready to unravel the web of contradictions that had begun to form. "Inspector, Dubois had gathered the remaining witnesses and suspects in the sitting room, a tense silence hanging in the air as Poirot entered. He gave each person a brief nod of acknowledgement, noting the different responses. Some were stiff, some almost too eager, and a few gave off a sense of unease that no one else seemed to pick up on. First, Poirot turned to the maid, Miss Violette, who had been cleaning the house that morning and had discovered the body. She was a slender woman, her face pale, eyes wide with apparent distress. She had been sobbing earlier, but now she was composed, though her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. "Miss Violette," Poirot began gently, his voice warm yet probing. "You found the body, yes? Can you recall what you saw when you first entered the room?" She nodded, her eyes cast downward, avoiding his gaze. I opened the door to clean the room, and there she was, Madame Lefebvre, lying on the floor. I screamed, and then I ran for help, that is all." Poirot's sharp gaze studied her closely. Something about her response didn't sit right. The hysteria from earlier had vanished too quickly, replaced by a calm that bordered on the practiced. He noted the way she clutched her skirt, as though trying to keep herself from fidgeting. "Miss Violette," he pressed, his tone soft but insistent. "You did not hear anything unusual before finding the body? No sounds, no disturbances?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together before she answered. "No, nothing at all. Everything was quiet." Poirot studied her silence with a critical eye. "You seem certain, yes?" The maid stiffened slightly, but said nothing. Poirot was not convinced, but he said no more. There was a nervousness in her words, a slight tension that contradicted the smoothness of her story. He would return to her later. Next, Poirot's attention shifted to Catherine's closest friend, Marguerite, a woman in her late 30s, her face drawn with worry. Marguerite had arrived at the house the day before and had been staying with Catherine for a few days. Her hair, once elegantly styled, now hung loosely around her shoulders, and her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. "Madame Marguerite," Poirot began, his voice calm and measured. You knew Madame Lefebvre well, I presume. Marguerite nodded, her gaze falling to the floor. We were very close. I cannot believe she is gone. Poirot inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Can you tell me where you were at the time of her death? Marguerite's eyes snapped up to meet his. I was in my room, resting. She stopped herself abruptly, her lips pressing together in a tight line. And the others? Poirot continued, his gaze unwavering. Did you hear anything strange, any sounds that stood out to you? She shifted uncomfortably, then shook her head. No, I didn't hear anything at all. I was tired from the journey and I went straight to my room after dinner. Poirot let the silence linger, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was something about her story that felt rehearsed, as though she were trying to hold something back. Did you perhaps notice anything unusual when you spoke to Madame Lefebvre earlier in the evening? Anything that might explain this tragedy? Marguerite's gaze faltered, and she hesitated a moment before speaking again. No, nothing unusual. Catherine was in good spirits. Poirot observed her closely, noticing how her voice caught on the mention of Catherine's name, a small crack in her otherwise composed demeanor. He could not ignore the feeling that something was off. She was either hiding something, or she had been caught in a lie that she hadn't fully realized yet. Madame Marguerite, Poirot said softly, his voice becoming a little more pointed. I believe you may know more than you're letting on. You speak of Catherine's good spirits, yet you appear quite shaken. The truth, I suspect, is closer to the surface than you think. Marguerite stiffened at his words, but she did not reply. Poirot turned away from her, his mind already moving forward, eager to hear the next statement. The contradictions in Marguerite's words were piling up, but there was something else, a deeper layer to her response that he would need time to pass through. Finally, Poirot turned his attention to the man who had been the most reluctant to speak, Henri Lefebvre, the late Madame Lefebvre's husband. Henri was a stout man in his mid-40s, dressed in mourning clothes that seemed freshly pressed, his face strained with a mix of grief and disbelief. He had not spoken much since Poirot's arrival, and had been watching the proceedings with a guarded expression. Henri Lefebvre, Poirot began, his voice even but curious. I understand you were in the house when your wife passed? Henri nodded, his jaw tightening as though the question pained him. I was in my study. I didn't know anything had happened until I heard the screams from the maid. Poirot raised an eyebrow, a small frown forming as he took in the man's story. You were in your study all evening? Yes. I had some work to finish. Catherine and I had dinner, and then I retired to my study. I didn't hear anything until the maid screamed. Poirot's eyes were sharp as he studied Henri. There was something about the man's demeanor that struck him as rehearsed, a lack of true grief behind the words. The way Henri had responded to the question about his wife's death seemed too calculated, too controlled. Poirot pressed on, and you did not go near your wife's room at any point during the evening? Henri's face remained expressionless, though his hands clenched momentarily. No, Monsieur Poirot, I had no reason to. Poirot's instincts told him that Henri Lefebvre was hiding something. Whether it was deliberate or subconscious, Poirot could not yet tell. But the contradictions were mounting, and the closer he got to the truth, the more it seemed that each person in the room was concealing a piece of the puzzle. As Poirot scanned the group once more, he felt the threads of deception weaving their way through the investigation, each lie and omission pointing toward a motive that had yet to fully materialize. He was certain of one thing. The key to unlocking the mystery lay not in what had been said, but in what had been left unsaid. With a final glance at the assembly, Poirot made his decision. It was time to dig deeper into their stories. The more Poirot delved into the web of motives surrounding Catherine Lefebvre's death, the tighter the strands seemed to pull. Each suspect had a reason, some clearer than others, yet none of the explanations seemed to fit neatly into the puzzle. Greed, jealousy, and revenge were all on the table, but the more Poirot analyzed, the more complex the situation appeared. The maid, Miss Violette, seemed the least likely to have committed the crime, but her nerves had set off a series of alarms in Poirot's mind. She had been the first to find the body, which, on the surface, suggested innocence. Yet the oddness of her initial response, the way she had seemingly steadied herself too quickly after the initial shock, made Poirot wonder if she were hiding something deeper. Was she afraid? Or perhaps complicit? Poirot knew better than to rule anyone out too early. His mind turned over the few scraps of conversation he had overheard when Miss Violette had spoken of Madame Lefebvre. The faint tremor in her voice had been too subtle to be mistaken for mere grief. There was something behind it, something she wasn't willing to share. Catherine Lefebvre's closest friend, Marguerite, had presented herself as the grieving widow, but Poirot could see that her composure was too well practiced, as if she had rehearsed these emotions before. Was it possible that the two women had been involved in some secret that no one else knew about? A hidden rivalry, or an unspoken betrayal? And then there was Henri Lefebvre, Catherine's husband. At first glance, his alibi seemed straightforward. He had been in his study, working alone. But Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that Henri's calmness was more than just a reflection of his grief. There was an undercurrent of something darker. His reaction to Poirot's questioning had been stiff, his answers too quick, his grief too controlled. A man who had just lost his wife would not behave in such a manner. Poirot's thoughts drifted back to the peculiar scene in Catherine's bedroom, where he had found the Scarlet Glove, discarded carelessly at the foot of the bed. The clue had made little sense at first, but as Poirot played with the idea, it seemed to take on a new meaning. The glove was too deliberate, too symbolic to have been left by accident. It had been placed there on purpose. Its color, the rich crimson, stood in stark contrast to the otherwise pristine surroundings. But why? Was it a signal? A message left for someone to find? The glove itself was an enigma, its origins unclear, its connection to the crime even more so. Poirot had already examined it closely, noting the subtle embroidery on the fabric, delicate, almost fragile, and the faint traces of a perfume that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. The scent lingered in his mind, but there was something about it that unsettled him, something that reminded him of one of the women in the house. The motive behind the murder, too, seemed elusive. Each of the suspects had a clear motive for wanting Catherine dead, but none of their alibis completely checked out. Henri's possible motive was perhaps the most obvious: money. He had been heavily involved in his wife's financial dealings, though whether that had led to the murder was yet to be determined. His coldness towards his wife, even in death, suggested a lack of genuine affection, but Poirot had learned not to jump to conclusions based on appearances alone. Marguerite, On the other hand was a woman of pride, and pride was a dangerous thing. Had she been jealous of Catherine? Had there been a rivalry of some sort? Or perhaps it was something more. The lingering tension between the two women, the way Marguerite had avoided direct answers and tried too hard to appear innocent. It didn't sit right with Poirot. What could she have had to gain from Catherine's death? The maid, Miss Violette, was still an enigma. She seemed harmless enough, but something in her demeanor made Poirot wonder if she were protecting someone, or perhaps even hiding her own secrets. Had she been instructed to cover up something, or had she been an unwitting accomplice? The question gnawed at him, as there was no clear reason why she would kill Catherine. But then, motive was often hidden beneath the surface. Poirot glanced at the suspects again, each of them sitting in the same room, each of them playing their part in this tragic play. The story they told seemed to contradict itself in subtle ways. Small discrepancies had already begun to surface in their statements, answers that didn't match, odd phrasing, slight shifts in body language. It was as though they were all trying too hard to maintain their innocence. Poirot's mind shifted toward the idea that perhaps the motive was something that none of them had considered, something far deeper than the usual concerns of jealousy or money. He turned his gaze back to the Scarlet Glove. It had to mean something. "Inspector Dubois," Poirot said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Tell me again about the timeline of the events last night. What time did the maid find the body?" Dubois, who had been sitting quietly at the table, reviewing the statements, looked up from his notes. "The maid claims she found the body shortly after 8:30 in the morning, but of course we can't be sure of the exact time." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, tapping his chin. "And when did Madame Lefebvre last have visitors?" "She had dinner with her husband around 7, sir, and after that there was no mention of anyone else coming by," Dubois answered. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. Dinner had been a social event, shared between Henri and Catherine, and yet no one had seen them interact beyond that. The maid had found the body hours later, but the timeline didn't quite add up. The Scarlet Glove, however, seemed to fit into a different puzzle, one that might not have been seen by the others. The more Poirot thought about it, the more he believed that the key to this mystery lay in unraveling the relationships between these people. Greed had played a part, no doubt, but so had other emotions: resentment, envy, pride, and even fear. As he pieced together their actions, their words, the motives all seemed to align, but not in a way he had expected. The deeper he dug, the more certain he became that this was no simple crime of passion. No, it was a carefully orchestrated plot, and each suspect had a piece of it. They were all involved in one way or another, but who had delivered the fatal blow? Who had the most to lose from Catherine's death? Poirot's mind raced as he retraced each moment, each word spoken, each gesture made. The maze of motives began to clear, but the most crucial clue, one that would reveal everything, remained hidden in plain sight. Poirot sat alone in the drawing-room of the Lefebvre estate, staring at the Scarlet Glove in front of him. The weight of the investigation bore heavily on his shoulders, but something about the evening felt off. The pieces were slowly falling into place, yet a persistent unease lingered, a gnawing sense that the true solution was still just beyond reach. Inspector Dubois had returned shortly after Poirot's last musings, a folder in hand, a slight excitement in his step. "Monsieur Poirot," Dubois said, setting the folder down in front of him, "we've just received word from the lab. We found something that might turn the tide. Poirot raised an eyebrow, though his expression remained calm. Ah, and what might this be? Dubois opened the folder, revealing a photograph of a silver cufflink. It was an intricate design, something Catherine Lefebvre's husband, Henri, was known to wear. We found this in the garden outside the study window. It matches the cufflinks Henri Lefebvre wore at dinner last night. Poirot's eyes flickered to the image. A small part of his mind immediately connected the piece to Henri's alibi, his study, the scene of his supposed solitude. The discovery seemed too perfect, too much of a straightforward link, a piece of evidence that the authorities had been waiting for. Cufflink, Poirot repeated, his fingers idly tracing the outline of the glove before him. He wasn't certain what to make of it, but a flicker of doubt stirred in his mind. He thought of Henri's actions, his coldness, the oddness in his answers. It seemed too convenient. "I think it's time we confront Henri Lefebvre," Poirot said, his voice betraying none of his suspicions. "Bring him in, Inspector." Within the hour, Henri had been ushered into the room, his posture stiff, and his face tightly composed. He carried himself as a man who believed the worst of the matter had passed, a man who thought his name had been cleared with the discovery of the cufflink. Poirot studied him closely, reading the subtle tension in his jaw, the nervous tapping of his fingers against his suit sleeve. "Mr. Lefebvre," Poirot began, leaning forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "It seems that this cufflink is yours, yes?" Henri's eyes briefly widened before he forced a tight smile. "Yes, it appears so. I must have lost it in the garden during my walk this morning." Poirot nodded slowly, the sound of the silence in the room growing louder with each passing second. "A walk in the morning? So you were out there when your wife's body was discovered?" Henri hesitated, the slightest shift in his posture. I didn't want to disturb anyone. It was an early hour." "And yet," Poirot continued, "you claim to have not noticed anything unusual. No signs of distress? No indication that something was wrong?" Henri's expression tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I wasn't aware of anything until the maid found the body. I swear it." Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepling together. "And yet this cufflink, Mr. Lefebvre, tells a different story, does it not?" Henri's brow furrowed, his gaze faltering for a moment. "I don't understand what you're implying." "The cufflink was found near the garden window," Poirot explained, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Close to where you claim you were walking. How, then, did it end?" "Up there if you were unaware." Henri opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted nervously around the room before returning to Poirot, his composure cracking ever so slightly. I didn't mean to." A chill ran through the room as Poirot stood and approached Henri. The cuffs of his jacket brushed the edges of the furniture, and he stopped just a few feet from the man, his gaze unblinking. Henri Lefebvre had been caught in his own lie. Inspector Dubois stepped forward, the tension in the air palpable. "So you admit to being involved?" Henri's eyes flickered, the desperation creeping into his voice. No, it's not like that. I didn't kill Catherine. I never meant for her to die." Poirot's voice cut through the panic. "Then explain, Mr. Lefebvre. Explain how your cufflink came to rest by the garden window. Explain why you lied about being in the study at the time of your wife's death." Henri stood there, his face flushed with sweat. For a long moment, he remained silent, weighing his words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. I wasn't alone in that study. Someone else. Someone who wanted to hurt her. Poirot nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead, trying to connect the dots. Who, Mr. Lefebvre? Henri seemed to shrink under Poirot's gaze, his eyes glancing nervously toward the door. I can't. No. It would ruin everything. At that moment, the door opened, and Marguerite entered the room. She had been listening just outside, and her presence now felt like the final piece of the puzzle. The woman stepped forward with a calmness that belied the tension in the air. "Think it's time we stop pretending," she said, her voice measured, but her eyes betraying a hint of something darker. She looked directly at Henri, then at Poirot. "You've got it all wrong, you know." Henri's face drained of colour. "Marguerite, what are you saying?" Poirot turned to Marguerite, his gaze sharp. "Please, continue." "I've been trying to protect him," she said, her voice growing colder. "Henri didn't kill Catherine, but he didn't need to. He didn't need to get his hands dirty. I did it." The room fell into a stunned silence. Henri's face twisted in confusion and disbelief. Poirot's mind whirled, trying to process her confession, but he wasn't satisfied. Something wasn't right. Marguerite smiled, but it was not the smile of someone who had just confessed. It was too controlled. "I wanted everything. I wanted Catherine's life. I wanted her place in Henri's heart and in her wealth. Henri was too weak to do what needed to be done." Poirot's gaze narrowed. "But the glove—" Marguerite laughed softly, the sound more mocking than genuine. "The glove was for you, Monsieur Poirot. A little gift from me, to lead you to the truth, but not the truth you expected. A false victory, as you might say." The realization hit Poirot like a thunderclap. This was all part of the plan. The cufflink had been planted, the evidence too perfect to be true. It was meant to lead him down a path of certainty, only to spring the trap when he least expected it. The true criminal had never been in the shadows. Marguerite had been in plain sight all along. But Poirot's mind had already shifted, calculating the next move, seeking the next clue, for the game was far from over. The threads were still tangled, and even in this false victory, the real story had yet to unfold. Poirot stood in the centre of the drawing room, his gaze fixed on Marguerite, the weight of her confession settling heavily between them. The words hung in the air, but they were far from the resolution he sought. His mind buzzed, a complex web of thoughts and connections forming. But it wasn't enough. Marguerite had confessed to murder, yet something about the whole scenario felt like a well-constructed play, one with an ending that hadn't been written yet. Henri remained silent, his disbelief shifting to anger. "You... what? All this time you... Enough!" Marguerite cut him off with a sharpness that startled them both. She straightened her posture, her eyes hardening. "You think it's all about the inheritance? You think that's what drove me? No, Henri. It's more than that. It's everything. I've been cleaning up your mess for years, and Catherine was just the last piece." Poirot's eyes flickered over her once more, weighing her words. He could see the cracks beneath her veneer, the fragility of someone who had been hiding far more than she let on. But this wasn't the breakthrough he'd been searching for. There was a cold, lingering sense that the surface had only been scratched. "Tell me, Marguerite," Poirot said softly, his voice controlled but his gaze intense. "How long have you known that your brother was involved in this?" She stiffened. "What do you mean?" Poirot's lips tightened into a thin line. "Your brother, Marcel. You didn't think I would notice the similarities, did you? His connection to the Lefebvre estate, the debts that were piling up, the ties to your marriage." Marguerite's composure faltered for the briefest moment, but Poirot caught it, just enough to make him sure of his suspicions. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice strained but too calculated to sound innocent. Poirot stepped closer, every word laced with the quiet assurance of someone who had already seen too much. "Marcel Lefebvre. Henri's cousin, wasn't he? The one who disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances, the one who had a falling out with the family and whose name was swept under the rug." Marguerite's jaw clenched. "That's irrelevant now. Marcel's dead." Poirot paused, letting her words linger for a moment. "Or is he?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it held the weight of a truth that was only just beginning to reveal itself. Marguerite's expression shifted again, this time something darker crossing her features. She seemed to struggle against the lie she was about to tell, or perhaps the truth she didn't want to admit. The room seemed to close in around them as Poirot's mind circled back to the threads of the past he had left unexamined. The Lefebvre family had been a portrait of wealth, status, and social standing, but there was a scar, a stain, hidden in the family's history that no one had cared to revisit. Henri and Marguerite's cousin, Marcel Lefebvre, had disappeared suddenly one night after a heated argument with Henri over the family's finances. It had been a scandal that had reverberated throughout the estate. The official story was that Marcel had simply run off, a man in disgrace, leaving behind a tarnished reputation. But Poirot knew better. Something didn't sit right with the disappearance of Marcel, and the puzzle pieces had always seemed incomplete. Now, in the wake of Catherine's death, an old, forgotten case had started to gain new significance. If Marcel had indeed returned, as Poirot suspected, it would tie everything together in a way that couldn't be ignored. "I believe," Poirot began, turning his attention back to Marguerite, "that your brother never truly left. I believe," he returned, hidden in the shadows, "and he has been pulling the strings this entire time." Marguerite's breath caught, her eyes flickering toward Henri, who was still frozen in his disbelief. "You're wrong," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Marcel is dead. Not dead," Poirot interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "Just waiting, just watching. And now, with Catherine gone, there is only one more piece to claim." Henri's face turned pale, his hands shaking as the weight of Poirot's words hit him. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot turned toward him, his voice steady but sharp. "I am suggesting that your cousin Marcel never left, that he has been orchestrating this whole affair for years. The debts, the inheritance, the lies, everything." Marguerite's facade cracked fully now, her eyes welling up with tears. But they weren't tears of regret or sorrow. They were tears of something much deeper, fear. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have no idea what it's like, how far we've gone to keep this hidden." Poirot took a step back, allowing the room to settle into a tense silence. Everything was beginning to fall into place, but there were still pieces left to find. He'd been right to feel something more was at play. This wasn't just about a greedy wife or a desperate husband. It was about something darker, A connection between family, secrets buried deep in the past, and the desperation to keep them buried. "You say Marcel is dead," Poirot said slowly, each word carefully measured, "but I wonder if that is the truth. I wonder if it is not your brother's shadow that has been hovering over this family for so long. I believe it is his hand that has guided you all along." Marguerite's eyes widened, her face blanching as she realized Poirot's meaning. No, you're wrong. We didn't do it for him." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I believe you did it for him, Marguerite. And now we will find him. The truth can no longer be hidden." Henri looked from Marguerite to Poirot, his mind clearly unraveling at the implications. "What does this mean? What do you want from us?" Poirot's voice remained calm but firm. "I want the truth. I want you to tell me everything, Henri. Everything about Marcel. About the debts, the hidden alliances, the lies that have been kept from the world. You can no longer afford to protect him, because in doing so, you protect the very force that destroyed your life." The room was silent again, but this time it was a silence of realization. The threads of the past had resurfaced, and in the light of Poirot's words, they were beginning to weave together in a tapestry of deceit and tragedy. Marcel's shadow loomed over them all, and the detective knew the final reveal was closer than ever. But this was only the beginning. The past wasn't done with them yet. The tension in the room was thick, and Poirot could feel the invisible weight of secrets pressing down on everyone. Marguerite's admission had cracked the facade of her composed exterior, but it had also raised more questions than answers. Henri was still struggling to digest the implications of what had just been revealed. But Poirot's mind raced, turning over every detail like a puzzle that had yet to reveal its true shape. If Marcel had returned as he suspected, then the entire scenario could be far more complex than anyone had imagined. He stood there, watching Marguerite closely. The subtle way her fingers trembled as she clutched the arm of the chair, the twitch of her lips when her gaze darted toward the door. Every movement was telling him something. He'd already picked up on the truth hidden behind her words. But now it was time to probe deeper, to push her in a way that would force the truth out. Of her, Poirot moved to the window, his back to them, as he gazed out over the sprawling estate. The silence in the room was suffocating, but he allowed it to linger, letting the moment stretch, forcing everyone to sit in the discomfort of their own thoughts. He needed to unsettle them, needed to make them feel exposed. And sometimes that was the best way to get someone to reveal more than they intended. He turned back slowly, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he spoke. "You've been hiding a great deal, Marguerite. I wonder if perhaps it's not just the truth about your brother that has been concealed." Marguerite flinched, but quickly recovered, her gaze hardening. "What do you mean?" "Ah," Poirot said, his voice soft and deliberate. "I believe you know far more than you've let on, and I believe you've been keeping it from all of us, your husband, your family, me. You see, there's always something more beneath the surface when someone tries so hard to appear innocent." Henri shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Poirot and Marguerite, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. But Marguerite didn't flinch, not yet. She remained poised, though a slight tension in her jaw betrayed the strain she was under. But Poirot wasn't fooled by her composure. His eyes flicked to her hands again, noticing the faintest traces of dirt beneath her nails. A small, odd detail, but one that hadn't escaped his trained observation. "You've had your fair share of secrets, haven't you, Marguerite?" Poirot continued, his gaze never leaving her. "But we must dig deeper now. We must uncover everything." He leaned forward, almost imperceptibly watching her reaction. Marguerite's eyes narrowed, and Poirot could sense a flicker of panic beneath her carefully crafted exterior. She knew, just as he did, that every small movement, every nuance of behavior could betray her. She was losing control, and Poirot could feel it. "I have no more to say," Marguerite snapped, standing up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're wrong. This is all nonsense. I've told you everything you need to know." Poirot didn't budge. "No, Marguerite, you haven't told me everything, but I think I know how to make you talk." Marguerite froze, the confidence slipping from her features. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. "I have my ways of making people reveal the truth. Methods that go beyond interrogation and accusation. It's a delicate art, but one I've mastered over the years." Henri watched the exchange, his confusion mounting. "What do you mean, Poirot? What is this about?" Poirot ignored him for a moment, his eyes locking onto Marguerite. "You see, it's not always about direct confrontation. Sometimes it's the smallest things, the ones people think are inconsequential, that reveal the most. You've made one small mistake, Marguerite, one that could be your undoing." Marguerite's eyes flickered, her hands tightening into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile, his eyes glinting with a mix of understanding and subtle amusement. "Oh, but you do. You see, Marguerite, you've been so focused on hiding your tracks, on protecting yourself and your brother, that you've overlooked something small but very revealing." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch, watching her closely. "The dirt beneath your nails, Marguerite," Poirot said, his voice almost a whisper. "You were in the garden earlier, weren't you? You've been planting something. Or perhaps you've been burying something." Marguerite's face went pale. Her eyes widened for the briefest moment, and Poirot could see the panic rise, her composure completely shattered. She was holding back, but not anymore. The facade was cracking. Henri, still processing the tension, looked between them. "What does this mean?" Poirot didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Marguerite, his gaze never leaving her. The silence in the room became oppressive as Marguerite realized her secret was no longer hidden. Finally, Marguerite spoke, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to go this far, I didn't—" But Poirot's calm, deliberate voice cut her off. "The garden. You went there, didn't you? To hide something, perhaps a piece of evidence, a clue you didn't want anyone to find." Marguerite's lips parted, but no words came out. The realization that Poirot had been watching her every move, that he had caught on to her smallest detail, was enough to unravel her control. Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice even further, making it clear he was not backing down. "I suggest we take a look in that garden, Marguerite. Perhaps you'll find it easier to talk once we uncover what you've hidden there." Marguerite didn't respond right away, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her fear. She was caught, and she knew it. The walls were closing in, and Poirot had given her nowhere left to turn. She had underestimated him, and now The game was over. As she looked toward the door, then back at Poirot, the words finally spilled out, shaky but determined. "All right, Poirot. You win. I'll show you." The detective gave a small nod, his eyes never leaving hers. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and with this unspoken admission, the final thread of deception was about to unravel. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in an eerie twilight. Poirot and Marguerite had stepped into the garden, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound accompanying them. The air was cool, a faint breeze rustling the leaves of the old trees surrounding the grounds. Despite the calmness of the night, there was a palpable tension that hung in the air, thick as fog. Poirot's mind raced as he carefully observed every movement, every flicker of emotion that crossed Marguerite's face. She led the way, her steps hesitant, her posture stiff, as though carrying the weight of her guilt with every stride. Poirot kept a respectful distance, but his eyes never left her. There was something in her body language, something unspoken that told him they were getting closer to the truth. Yet, as they reached the farthest corner of the garden, where the hedges were thick and the shadows deep, Poirot's instincts flared. Something was wrong. "Marguerite," Poirot said, his voice calm but commanding, "where did you hide it?" She didn't respond immediately, her gaze flicking nervously toward the dense bushes ahead. Poirot could see her breath quicken, the telltale signs of someone about to crack under pressure. She had been pretending all along, and now the weight of her deception was too much to bear. I don't know if I can," Marguerite said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand hovered near the base of a large, weathered stone statue in the corner of the garden. Poirot had noticed it earlier, but it had meant nothing at the time. Now it seemed to be the focal point of her anxiety. Poirot's gaze shifted to the statue, his sharp eyes scanning every inch. "I think you can. You've come this far, and the truth is right within your reach." She faltered for a moment, then nodded. Slowly she dropped to her knees, reaching for the stone base. Poirot stood at a distance, watching with careful attention. The night seemed to hold its breath as Marguerite's hands worked with an almost unnatural urgency. Then, just as Poirot's anticipation reached its peak, her fingers froze. "What is it, Marguerite?" Poirot asked, his voice still calm, though there was an edge to it now. Marguerite's expression was a mixture of disbelief and confusion, as she pulled her hand back, revealing nothing but dirt and old roots beneath the stone. The small patch of earth where she had been digging was empty, as if the object she had been hiding had vanished. "Impossible," she muttered, her voice trembling. "It was here. I swear it was here." Poirot's eyes narrowed. His mind raced as he processed the scene. The evidence, whatever it was gone. And it wasn't just misplaced. Someone had taken it. Someone had anticipated this very moment. "Someone's been here before us," Poirot said softly, though his mind was already working through the possibilities. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a simple case of a missing item. This was sabotage. Marguerite's head shot up, panic flashing across her face. "No, this can't be. I haven't touched it since—" "Since when?" Poirot interrupted, his tone hardening. "I don't know," she snapped, standing up and brushing the dirt off her knees. "I can't think straight right now. You don't understand. It was right here." Poirot's sharp gaze remained fixed on her, but there was no time to waste on empty explanations. "We must return to the house. There are other ways to find out who is hiding the truth." Marguerite nodded absently, still in shock, as they made their way back toward the estate. But as Poirot walked ahead, he could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the tension, the feeling that someone was watching them. The case was spiraling out of control, and he could feel the invisible hand of the enemy tightening its grip around the investigation. When they returned to the mansion, Poirot found Henri pacing in the drawing room, his face flushed with a mixture of concern and agitation. The detective barely gave him a glance before walking past, heading straight for the study. Henri's voice followed him. "Poirot, you have to understand, we're no closer to the truth, and now, this garden business, what does it all mean?" Poirot stopped for a brief moment, turning to face him, but his eyes held no emotion, only the cold precision of a man who knew he was running out of time. "You misunderstand, monsieur. We have only just begun to uncover the depths of this mystery, but it is clear to me now. Someone is working against us. The evidence you believe we had, it's been taken." Henri's expression darkened. "Taken? But by whom? How? We were the only ones in the garden." Poirot's mind was already analyzing the possibilities, running through the list of suspects like a mental checklist. Who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to interfere in the investigation? It wasn't just a matter of the missing evidence anymore. The very foundation of the case was under attack. "Not necessarily," Poirot replied. "It is possible that someone among us has more knowledge of this situation than we've realized. We are being played, monsieur, and the game is far more dangerous than we think." Henri looked lost, his brow furrowed in confusion. But Poirot could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. The detective's words were taking root. The truth was slipping further out of reach, and every move they made seemed to lead them deeper into a labyrinth of deception. Poirot turned back toward the door, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. The missing evidence was just the beginning. Someone had made their move, but Poirot had one advantage. He was always one step ahead, and he would find the truth, no matter how far it had been buried. But for now, the silence in the room weighed heavily on him. The shadows were lengthening, and time was running out. The tension in the air was nearly unbearable as Poirot sat at the edge of the study desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood. Marguerite's confession about the missing evidence hung in the air, but something still didn't sit right. He had never believed the case was as simple as it appeared, and now, as the pieces began to shift, the detective felt the unease that had been creeping up his spine for days start to surface. Henri stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his face illuminated in the dim light. The fire's crackling was the only sound breaking the silence between them, and Poirot's thoughts ran deep, turning over every detail in his mind. The missing evidence was a significant blow, but in truth the real question was, who was controlling the board? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. The door swung open suddenly, and the housekeeper, breathless and pale, appeared in the threshold, her face flushed with panic. "Detective Poirot," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You need to come quickly. There's been another incident." The words hit like a punch. Poirot was on his feet in an instant, his heart rate quickening. Henri was at his side in a heartbeat, his concern evident in the furrow of his brow. "What happened?" Henri asked, voice tight with anxiety. "Another murder," the housekeeper whispered, looking over her shoulder nervously. "In the East Wing." Poirot didn't waste a moment. He followed the housekeeper through the winding corridors of the mansion, his thoughts already racing ahead. Another death. It couldn't be coincidence. The shadow of the first crime had barely begun to settle when it happened again. They reached the east wing, and Poirot took in the scene before him. The room was eerily quiet, but there was a suffocating heaviness that spoke volumes. A body lay on the ground, lifeless and twisted, eyes wide in terror, just like the first. The victim was none other than Gerard, the young man who had been working in the household. He had been quiet, seemingly harmless, and entirely unimportant until now. His death added a layer of complexity to the case that Poirot wasn't sure how to unravel. Henri stood over the body, his expression one of horror, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the man's cold, lifeless hand. "This can't be happening again," he murmured, his voice raw with disbelief. Poirot stepped forward, examining the scene with his usual methodical calm. The room seemed almost too pristine, as though nothing had been disturbed. No sign of struggle. No indication of a break-in or forced entry. The only clue, if it could be called that, was a small, unassuming piece of fabric clutched in the victim's hand. A scrap of material, torn from a larger cloth. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he examined it closely. It was old, frayed at the edges with the faintest hint of a pattern woven into it. Henri, clearly shaken, turned to Poirot, his face flushed with growing anxiety. "What does it mean, Poirot? This doesn't make sense. The first murder was brutal, but this feels different. It's like they're taunting us." Poirot didn't respond immediately, his mind running through every possibility. His fingers lingered on the fabric, studying the weave, the color, the texture. He'd seen something like it before, something buried in the details of his earlier interviews, something that hadn't clicked until now. A thought struck him, sharp and sudden. "Henri, do you recall the tapestry in the hallway near the grand staircase?" Henri looked at him, confused. "The tapestry? What does that have to do with—" "Everything," Poirot interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos of the moment. "The fabric is identical to that of the one in the tapestry." Henri's eyes widened, but before he could speak, Poirot was already striding out of the room, his mind piecing together fragments of a larger puzzle. He had no time to waste. The hallway was eerily silent as they hurried back toward the staircase. Poirot's fingers brushed against the ancient fabric of the tapestry, and as he examined it more closely, his suspicion grew. The patterns weren't random. The tapestry depicted a scene that Poirot had only half noticed before. Two figures, cloaked in shadows, one holding a knife, the other a key. The symbolism was too blatant to ignore now. "This is it," Poirot muttered under his breath. "The clue was here all along." Henri's voice broke the silence as he approached, his face grim. "What are you saying, Poirot? That the murders were somehow connected to this tapestry?" Poirot turned to face him, his expression hardening. "Not just the murders, Henri, the entire game. Someone is using this tapestry as a map, a guide to their actions, and Gerard, he must have known something. He wasn't just a random victim." Henri opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he heard a sharp noise from the direction of the study. It was the sound of a door slamming open. Poirot and Henri exchanged a look of alarm and rushed toward the sound. What they found was a chilling surprise. The study door was wide open, but no one was inside. The desk, previously neatly organized, was now in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a chair had been knocked over. But it was the open safe in the corner that caught their attention. It had been rifled through, the contents, files, documents, were gone. Poirot's heart sank as he quickly moved toward the safe, his mind racing. They weren't just after the victims anymore. Someone was after the information, the very truth that could unlock everything. Someone was making their move, and they were making it fast. This changes everything, Henri whispered, his voice tinged with fear. Poirot nodded grimly. The game had escalated. The killer was no longer playing by the rules. They were tearing apart everything in their path, and with each step, they were drawing closer to the final, devastating truth. Poirot had one goal now: stop the next move before it was too late. But the question gnawed at him, unsettling and dangerous. Was he already too late? Poirot stood motionless before the disordered safe, his mind racing to connect the fragmented pieces that had been scattered across the investigation. The open safe was a sign of someone desperate, someone who had realized they were no longer operating in the shadows, but in full view of the detective. Yet despite the chaos unfolding, Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that the puzzle was beginning to form, albeit at an agonizingly slow pace. Henri had stepped back, his face pale. This can't be coincidence, Poirot. They know we're getting closer. They've taken what we need, what we were about to find. How can we stop them now? Poirot didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the room once more, searching for anything that might give him an edge. The open safe, the scattered papers, the missing documents. They all pointed to one thing: desperation. But Poirot knew that murder, in the end, was always about more than desperation. It was about control, about power, about orchestrating a situation from the shadows where others were forced to play the villain's game. His gaze lingered on the desk, where several of the papers that had been carelessly tossed aside seemed oddly placed. A detail caught his eye: a coffee cup that hadn't been knocked over in the chaos. It was sitting at the far corner of the desk, away from where the documents had been scattered. Strange. It wasn't the sort of position a person would leave a cup by accident. They would have placed it either on the desk, near their workspace, or on the other side of the room. But this was deliberate. He approached the desk carefully, his fingers brushing the rim of the cup as he inspected it. Inside, a thin scrap of paper had been tucked under the base, a paper so slight it could easily be overlooked, but Poirot never missed the smallest of details. With a quick motion, he retrieved the scrap. It was nothing remarkable, just a piece of scrap paper, scribbled with an unfamiliar phone number. But to Poirot, it was a sudden burst of clarity. The phone number had to be linked to something, or someone. "Henri, look at this," Poirot said quietly, holding up the slip. Henri didn't even seem to notice the significance of it at first, his eyes still wide with confusion. But as Poirot explained, a slow realization began to dawn on him. Who would leave this here, and why? Henri murmured, running a hand through his hair. Poirot didn't respond, already lost in thought. This was the key, the crucial piece of the puzzle that had been right under their noses. The coffee cup, seemingly trivial, had been a signal, but to what end? The number wasn't in any format that he recognized. It wasn't a direct call for help, nor did it seem like a deliberate clue left behind for the detective. This was something different. Poirot's mind flashed back to the conversations he'd had with each of the suspects. The insignificant moments in their statements, the oddities in their behavior, all the things they had brushed off as unrelated. began to align in a new pattern. He turned to Henri. "The phone number. It's from a payphone. The kind one might find hidden in places no one would think to look." Henri raised an eyebrow, but Poirot wasn't finished. "And do you recall the strange comment made by Georges? When he mentioned the old place, a perfect hiding spot. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I see that it was intentional. He was giving us a clue, one that was meant to seem meaningless. A payphone, Henri, perhaps even the one that connects to the tapestry itself." Henri looked confused, but Poirot pressed on, his voice tightening with growing conviction. "Remember the fabric, the identical pattern we saw in the tapestry? It wasn't simply a thematic choice. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The tapestry wasn't just a backdrop to the crime. It was the map. Everything that's happening, every death, every clue, ties back to this image. The payphone, the comment from Georges, the positioning of the coffee cup, it all fits now." Henri's face blanched as the weight of Poirot's words sank in. He was starting to see it now, too. The cases of murder were no longer isolated events. They were orchestrated, linked by threads that went far deeper than they had originally imagined. The victims had been chosen for reasons they hadn't fully understood before. Each one had been involved in some way with the people surrounding the tapestry, the fabric of their intertwined fates. Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed in understanding. It was never about the victims, not entirely. It was always about who held the information, what they knew, and how badly the killer needed to silence them. Henri swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the case crashing down on him. "You mean the victims were in the way of something more important? Information about the past, something hidden?" Poirot nodded slowly, as if reaffirming the conclusions that had only just clicked in his mind. "Exactly," he said. "It's not just a murder. It's a cover-up. The murderer is trying to bury something that stretches far beyond the lives of these people." As Poirot stood there, an icy shiver ran down his spine. The crime had taken on a far more sinister light. The shadowy figures, the dead victims, the cryptic comments, the tapestry, and the seemingly innocuous objects scattered about the room. All of it was connected by something far older and more dangerous than he had realized. And then it hit him. "The missing documents," Poirot murmured. "They weren't just random pieces of information. They were a map of the tapestry's true origins. Whoever is behind this wanted to erase the past, to erase the truth." Henri's jaw clenched as he understood. The murderer had been erasing every trace, every clue. But now they had a new weapon. Knowledge. "Poirot," Henri whispered. "If that's true, what comes next? What do we do?" Poirot looked toward the open door, where the shadows of the evening were creeping in. His voice was steady, unwavering. "Now, Henri, we follow the pattern to the end. We find the truth buried beneath these deaths, and we stop the killer before they can finish what they started." The pattern had emerged. The game was on. Poirot and Henri made their way through the rain-soaked streets, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy in the air. The phone number, the pattern of the crimes, the seemingly disconnected events, all of it now pointed to one terrifying truth. They were on the verge of uncovering a motive more twisted than they had ever imagined. The investigation had unfolded in a manner that seemed almost too perfect, too orchestrated. Every step had led to the next, the clues growing more intricate with each passing hour. But the most recent revelation, the discovery of the hidden documents, the real key to understanding the tapestry's origins, had opened a door into a labyrinth of secrets. Now it was clear, this was not just about revenge, not just about greed. This was about something far more insidious, something buried beneath the surface for years, carefully concealed. As they approached the dimly lit office building where the last clue had pointed them, Poirot's thoughts continued to churn. There was something that didn't quite add up. Georges, who had seemed like an innocent pawn in the beginning, now appeared to be far more central to the case than they had ever suspected. But the twist was still elusive. What could tie the suspect to the tapestry in such a deep, personal way? Henri spoke suddenly, his voice low, as though speaking his thoughts aloud might make them real. "Poirot, I don't understand. Why go to all this trouble, all this death? It doesn't make sense. What's the point? What does the tapestry have to do with any of this?" Poirot paused for a moment, taking in the rain-slicked streets, his gaze narrowing as he pieced together the puzzle. "That's the question, Henri. What is it truly about? The murders are not isolated incidents. Each victim, each death was a thread woven into this larger, more complex narrative. The answer lies in the people involved. But I believe the truth is closer than we think, and it isn't simply about the past, it's about control." Henri's confusion deepened. "Control? But how does that explain all of this?" Poirot looked at him sharply. "The tapestry, Henri, it was never just about art or history. It's a key, a symbol of power, a reminder of a time when certain families held sway over others, controlling the narrative, controlling the future. The past was something to be rewritten, erased if need be, to keep certain truths buried." Henri's eyes widened in realization. "You're saying the murders are tied to the control of history? Someone wants to rewrite it?" "Precisely. But not in the way we expected. It isn't about rewriting history for the sake of the present. It's about erasing the remnants of an old power struggle. A war fought quietly in the shadows, but one that still influences every move made in the present." As they arrived at the building, Poirot's mind was already racing ahead, connecting dots. The walls of the office building were cold, forbidding, and too quiet for the urgency that gripped the situation. The night's events had set everything into motion, and now it was no longer just a matter of solving a murder. It was a race against time. Inside, the building seemed almost too still, the silence pressing in on them. Poirot walked toward the hidden room where the final piece of the puzzle, the stolen documents, were hidden. Henri followed closely, but there was a tension in the air that made it impossible to ignore the nagging feeling that they were being watched. They had crossed into dangerous territory. Poirot stopped in front of a thick velvet curtain, pausing for a moment to consider. The space behind it had been untouched since their last visit. Yet there was a palpable sense of expectancy hanging in the air. He pushed aside the curtain. The documents were still there, hidden beneath layers of dust and forgotten papers, untouched. But something else was in the room, something out of place. The safe was open, the lock mechanism exposed, and the surrounding floor was disturbed. It was as though someone had been here recently, and not just anyone. "Henri, look," Poirot whispered, pointing toward a single item that had been deliberately placed in the middle of the room. It was an old, tattered photograph, yellowed with age, showing a group of men standing together. In the back row stood Georges, his expression hard and determined, his posture unyielding. but it was the man standing beside him, the one with the unsettling smirk, who captured Poirot's attention. A flash of recognition hit him. This man, Poirot murmured, the connection forming in his mind. Henri, do you remember the name I mentioned earlier? The one that seemed to have no connection to any of this? Henri blinked, his mind racing. The historian? The one from the archives? Precisely, Poirot replied. This man is the historian's grandfather. And Georges was related to him more than just through professional ties. This is a family matter, Henri. The tapestry, the murders, the theft. It's all about a family feud that has gone unresolved for generations. Henry's mouth went dry as the pieces clicked into place. The motive was not about money. It wasn't about power. It was about legacy. The family that had once controlled the region, the one whose history had been so deliberately erased, had been struggling to keep the truth hidden. The tapestry was a symbol of that struggle, a piece of evidence too dangerous to remain intact. The real shock, however, was the revelation of Georges' true role. He had not been an innocent player caught in the web of conspiracy. He had been the architect all along. The killings had been his way of restoring a legacy that had been buried. The past, hidden beneath layers of lies, had never truly been erased. It had been waiting, watching until the right moment to resurface. As the enormity of the revelation set in, Poirot's voice was heavy with conviction. Georges didn't want revenge, he wanted restoration, a return to an old world, one where his family reigned supreme. He believed that erasing the past was the only way to make way for the future. Henri shook his head in disbelief. To kill for this? To destroy everything for the sake of a family's name? Poirot's expression softened, a touch of sadness in his eyes. Yes, Henri, it is the darkest of human motives. The belief that the future can only be built upon the destruction of the past. The villain was never... Henri's confusion deepened. Control? But how does that explain all of this? Poirot looked at him sharply. The tapestry, Henri, it was never just about art or history. It's a key, a symbol of power, a reminder of a time when certain families held sway over others, controlling the narrative, controlling the future. The past was something to be rewritten, erased if need be, to keep certain truths buried. Henry's eyes widened in realization. You're saying the murders are tied to the control of history? Someone wants to rewrite it? Precisely. But not in the way we expected. It isn't about rewriting history for the sake of the present. It's about erasing the remnants of an old power struggle. A war fought quietly in the shadows, but one that still influences every move made in the present. As they arrived at the building, Poirot's mind was already racing ahead, connecting dots. The walls of the office building were cold, forbidding, and too quiet for the urgency that gripped the situation. The night's events had set everything into motion, and now it was no longer just a matter of solving a murder. It was a race against time. Inside, the building seemed almost too still, the silence pressing in on them. Poirot walked toward the hidden room where the final piece of the puzzle, the stolen documents, were hidden. Henri followed closely, but there was a tension in the air that made it impossible to ignore the nagging feeling that they were being watched. They had crossed into dangerous territory. Poirot stopped in front of a thick velvet curtain, pausing for a moment to consider. The space behind it had been untouched since their last visit, yet there was a palpable sense of expectancy hanging in the air. He pushed aside the curtain. The documents were still there, hidden beneath layers of dust and forgotten papers, untouched. But something else was in the room, something out of place. The safe was open, the lock mechanism exposed, and the surrounding floor was disturbed. It was as though someone had been here recently, and not just anyone. "Henri, look," Poirot whispered, pointing toward a single item that had been deliberately placed in the middle of the room. It was an old, tattered photograph, yellowed with age, showing a group of men standing together. In the back row stood Georges, his expression hard and determined, his posture unyielding. But it was the man standing beside him, the one with the unsettling smirk, who captured Poirot's attention. A flash of recognition hit him. "This man," Poirot murmured, the connection forming in his mind. "Henri, do you remember the name I mentioned earlier? The one that seemed to have no connection to any of this?" Henri blinked, his mind racing. "The historian? The one from the archives?" "Precisely," Poirot replied. "This man is the historian's grandfather. And Georges was related to him more than just through professional ties. This is a family matter, Henri. The tapestry, the murders, the theft. It's all about a family feud that has gone unresolved for generations." Henry's mouth went dry as the pieces clicked into place. The motive was not about money. It wasn't about power. It was about legacy. The family that had once controlled the region, the one whose history had been so deliberately erased, had been struggling to keep the truth hidden. The tapestry was a symbol of that struggle, a piece of evidence too dangerous to remain intact. The real shock, however, was the revelation of Georges' true role. He had not been an innocent player caught in the web of conspiracy. He had been the architect all along. The killings had been his way of restoring a legacy that had been buried. The past, hidden beneath layers of lies, had never truly been erased. It had been waiting, watching until the right moment to resurface. As the enormity of the revelation set in, Poirot's voice was heavy with conviction. Georges didn't want revenge, he wanted restoration, a return to an old world, one where his family reigned supreme. He believed that erasing the past was the only way to make way for the future. Henri shook his head in disbelief. To kill for this? To destroy everything for the sake of a family's name? Poirot's expression softened, a touch of sadness in his eyes. Yes, Henri, it is the darkest of human motives. The belief that the future can only be built upon the destruction of the past. The villain was never a mere murderer. They were a person who had been consumed by their need for control, for the preservation of a family's name, no matter the cost. The true motive had been laid bare, a motive so chilling in its simplicity that it was almost impossible to comprehend. But it was real. The killer had not acted out of malice or vengeance, but out of a twisted desire to reclaim what was thought lost. And now the final confrontation was only moments away. Poirot stood still, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the dimly lit room. The sense of finality was in the air. Everything had led to this moment. He could feel the weight of the investigation on his shoulders, the silent pressure building, but his composure never wavered. He had seen enough, understood enough. Georges had made his move, and now it was time for the final confrontation. Defile, hidden motive, the carefully laid out plan, it all culminated in the same conclusion. Georges, with his relentless pursuit of legacy, had underestimated the one thing Poirot had mastered, the art of reading people. The detective knew exactly how to play this final hand. It wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about making Georges face it head-on. The phone rang once, sharp in the silence of the room, echoing through the space like a warning. Poirot glanced at Henri, who stood beside him, the weight of their discovery sinking in. Henri had always trusted Poirot's judgment, but now there was a new level of urgency between them. They both understood. If they didn't act now, everything they had worked for would slip through their fingers. "It's time," Poirot said quietly, his voice steady. "We must take him by surprise, Henri. The trap is set, but he mustn't know we're watching him yet." Henri nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "You think he'll come here?" Poirot didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step toward the wall where the tapestry hung, the symbol of everything that had been carefully concealed for so long. He studied the rich colors, the delicate threads, all of it now more significant than ever. The tapestry wasn't just an object, it was the very thing Georges wanted to protect, the thing he was willing to kill for. "He'll come," Poirot finally said, his voice firm. "The temptation to finish what he started is too great. He believes he can erase the past, Henry, but he is wrong." Outside, the soft hum of city traffic could be heard through the walls, the world unaware of the unfolding drama within these four walls. The quiet murmur of footsteps broke the stillness, and Poirot's eyes flicked toward the door. The time had come. Georges entered, his face a mask of calm, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. He knew something was off, something was different, but he couldn't put his finger on it, not yet. The detective had played his cards expertly, giving Georges just enough rope to believe he was still in control. Poirot waited, his gaze unwavering, as Georges stepped into the room. The light cast strange shadows on his face, and for the first time, Poirot saw the true weight of his obsession in the way his eyes darted around the space. "You're late," Poirot said, his voice measured, every word deliberate. "I've been expecting you." Georges stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot took a step forward, his movements calm, calculated. "You do, Georges. You've made it very clear that you want the past erased, buried beneath lies and murder. But it's over now. You're trapped." Georges laughed, a short, hollow sound, more nervous than amused. He tried to maintain his composure, but his hands betrayed him, clenching at his sides. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, attempting to brush past Poirot, but Poirot was already blocking his path, his presence unyielding. "No, Georges, you will listen. The truth is already out. Every thread you thought you could pull, every lie you spun, none of it will protect you anymore. You wanted to control history, rewrite it in your favor, but the truth is stronger than you." The room was charged with a tense silence. Georges' eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Poirot, his mind racing for an escape route, a way out. But Poirot was a wall, a force that Georges could not outmaneuver. The detective had already anticipated this moment. He knew Georges would try to run, try to hide one last time. But he was ready. Georges moved suddenly, his eyes narrowing with a new intensity. He lunged toward the door, his hands reaching for the handle. But before he could turn it, Poirot stepped forward, blocking him with a simple motion. Georges froze, his breath shallow. "Don't do it, Georges," Poirot said softly. the calm in his voice betraying the undercurrent of authority that ran through every word. "There is nowhere to go. No more lies. It's over." For a moment, there was no movement, no sound. The world outside seemed distant, as if nothing existed but the two of them in that room. Georges stood still, his face flushed with anger, fear, and disbelief. He was caught. He knew it. And yet he still couldn't bring himself to admit it. The weight of his own actions crushed down on him. "You were always going to lose," Poirot continued, his voice unwavering. "You were never as clever as you thought. Your need to control, to erase, it controlled you in the end." Georges' hand trembled as it hovered near the door handle. His eyes darted around, looking for something, anything, to change the course of events. But there was nothing left. The pieces had fallen into place, and now the final confrontation was here. He was out of options. The truth was clear now. The tapestry, the murders, the stolen evidence, all of it had been part of a twisted game designed by a man too consumed by his own need for power to see the inevitable conclusion. Georges had thought he could manipulate the past, rewrite it in his own image, but the past had a way of revealing itself, even through the darkest of lies. "I never wanted this," Georges whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own admission. "No?" Poirot's eyes were sharp, piercing. "Then why kill? Why destroy everything to protect a lie?" Georges flinched, his gaze falling to the floor. For a moment it seemed as though he might collapse, as if the burden of his actions had finally broken through the facade he had built. And then, with a deep, resigned breath, he whispered, "Because I had to. They left me no choice." Poirot's expression softened, but only for a moment. He had no sympathy for Georges' reasoning, no room for excuses. The damage had been done. The lives lost were not just a consequence of one man's obsession. They were the result of a desire to rewrite history at any cost. "You always had a choice," Poirot said firmly, his eyes steady. "But you chose destruction instead." Georges finally looked up, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. There was no turning back now. The truth had been revealed, and the game was over. As the police arrived, summoned by Henri's quiet phone call, Georges' defiance crumbled. He made no move to resist, no attempt to flee. It was over. The final confrontation had played out, exactly as Poirot had known it would. The past, the present, and the future all converged in that one moment, when the truth could no longer be hidden, no longer be twisted. The detective had won. Just as the weight of Georges' defeat settled, into the air a quiet murmur passed through the room. The police were already beginning to secure the area, and Henri stood nearby, his gaze locked on Georges, who had been led to a corner, hands cuffed, eyes still wide with disbelief. Poirot, however, was not entirely at ease. The finality of the moment felt too easy. His intuition, honed over years of navigating intricate webs of deception, stirred like a silent alarm. There was a nagging feeling that something important, was still hidden, lingering in the shadows. He turned slowly, observing the room with an intensity that could only come from a mind that saw beyond the immediate. Henri caught the shift in Poirot's demeanor. "What is it, Poirot?" he asked, his voice low, the question laced with a tinge of anxiety. It was clear that Henri trusted Poirot's judgment with his very life, but something in the detective's posture was making him uneasy. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he approached the window, where the evening light was beginning to fade. The scene outside, so calm and serene, felt like an illusion, one that had been carefully crafted in order to hide the cracks in the foundation. It was too perfect, too neatly tied up. "There is something off," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. Georges' confession. It fits too neatly. He's been trying to cover his tracks for far too long, but this feels like a game. Henri frowned. "You think someone else was involved?" Poirot did not answer immediately. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the last bit of the puzzle, the piece he had missed in his haste to reach the conclusion. Georges was guilty, that much was certain, but was he the mastermind? Or had he been a pawn, manipulated by someone with even more to lose? As Poirot's thoughts moved faster, something clicked in his mind. An offhand remark made by Georges earlier, one that had seemed almost trivial at the time. It was a comment about someone else who had been involved in the tapestry's creation. At first, Poirot had dismissed it as another attempt to redirect suspicion, but now he saw it in a different light. What if Georges wasn't the architect of the entire scheme? Poirot turned abruptly, catching Henri's eye. "There is more," he said, his voice firm. "Something important has been overlooked. Georges, he's not the only one with a hand in this." Henri blinked in confusion. "Are you suggesting someone else is involved?" But he confessed. He said he acted alone. Poirot shook his head, his expression hardening. "Georges is a puppet, Henri. A clever one, yes, but a puppet all the same. He wasn't the first to act. He was the one who followed." Henri's brow furrowed. "Then who? Who's been pulling the strings?" Poirot's eyes swept the room again, settling on the tapestry that had been the center of everything from the beginning. He studied it for a long moment, then stepped toward it. The fabric shimmered under the low light, the rich colors seeming to mock him with their tranquility. How many lies had it concealed? How many secrets had it borne witness? 2? He reached out and ran his fingers lightly along the threads, pausing on a small detail near the bottom edge. There, hidden in plain sight, was the key. The stitchwork, there was something peculiar about it, a slight inconsistency in the pattern that hadn't seemed important until now. Poirot's fingers hovered over it, and with a careful tug, he pulled the edge of the tapestry aside, revealing a hidden compartment embedded in the wall behind it. Henri gasped as Poirot carefully lifted a small, weathered box from the cavity. "This was not Georges' doing," Poirot said quietly, a trace of disbelief in his voice. The tapestry was a symbol, not just of the past, but of something far more personal. Someone wanted to preserve it, someone who had the power to hide things, and the means to make sure no one looked too closely. Henri looked from the box to Poirot, his confusion deepening. "What's inside?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. He had already opened the box and now carefully removed a single, folded letter. The paper was old, the ink faded, but legible. As Poirot unfolded it, his sharp eyes scanned the contents. It was a letter addressed to someone Poirot recognized, none other than one of the leading figures in the city's historical preservation society. The letter spoke of a plan to manipulate the historical narrative surrounding the tapestry, to ensure certain details were erased in exchange for financial gain and political favor. The true mastermind was not Georges. It was someone who had long been operating in the shadows, someone who had used Georges as a pawn in a larger scheme to protect their own legacy. The mastermind was none other than Charles Lemoine, the very person who had acted as the go-between for the tapestry's restoration. Poirot's heart sank as the full weight of the revelation hit him. Charles had orchestrated everything, manipulating Georges for his own benefit. Georges, with his need for control, had unwittingly played into the hands of a much older, much more cunning individual. The tapestry was never meant to be just an object of art. It was a symbol of Lemoine's attempt to rewrite history for his own gain. Henri stood there, his mouth agape. "Lemoine?" he asked incredulously. "But why? Why would he do this?" Poirot's gaze was hard. "Because some people will do anything to protect their legacy, Henri. They will destroy everything around them to ensure that they are remembered." Lemoine knew that the tapestry was more than just a piece of art. It was the key to his influence, to his place in history. And Georges was simply the means by which he could ensure that no one would question his carefully crafted narrative. Henri stared at the letter, then back at Poirot. So, Georges wasn't the villain after all? No, Poirot replied. Georges was a victim, manipulated by someone who understood the power of history and the lengths to which people will go to control it. As the truth sank in, Poirot felt a sense of reluctant admiration for Lemoine's genius. It had all been so subtle, so perfectly executed, and yet, as always, the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how well hidden. The final twist had turned everything on its head. The case, which had seemed resolved, was now far more complicated than ever before. The mastermind was still out there, waiting for the right moment to make his move. And for Poirot, that meant one more round of the game. A final test of his intellect, a final confrontation with the hidden forces that had been at work all along. The air in the room was thick with anticipation as the revelation of Lemoine's involvement echoed through the quiet space. Henri stood still, his mind racing, trying to process the complexity of the situation, but Poirot remained calm, his demeanor unwavering in the face of everything that had transpired. Lemoine, the man whose hands had been in everything all along, had managed to stay hidden, operating in the shadows with an almost maddening patience. And now, after all this time, Poirot had uncovered the key to the mystery, but that didn't mean the case was over. It wasn't finished yet, and Poirot knew better than to assume that the final chapter had been written. Henri broke the silence, his voice laced with frustration. "So we have everything now, Poirot. The letter, the confession, the entire truth. And yet here we are. The mastermind is still out there. What's to stop him from slipping through our fingers?" Poirot turned slowly to face his companion. "Ah, Henri, my friend, that is the very crux of it, is it not? The mystery is solved. But the villain—" Poirot's eyes narrowed, his sharp gaze sweeping the room, as though searching for the answer that was still eluding him. "The villain has not been captured yet." Henri shook his head, his impatience palpable. "Then what are we waiting for?" Poirot's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We are waiting for the final piece to fall into place, Henri. We have everything we need, but Lemoine is no fool. He will not allow himself to be caught easily. The game is not over yet." It was only then that Henri understood what Poirot had been alluding to. There had been something in Lemoine's behavior all along, an odd sense of assurance, a complete lack of panic, as if he knew he was always a step ahead. Even now, in the face of the truth being exposed, Lemoine had remained absent. It was as though he had anticipated every move Poirot made, every twist in the investigation, as if he had already planned his exit long before the truth had come to light. Poirot's voice broke through Henri's thoughts, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Do you remember, Henri, when Georges first confessed? How quickly and eagerly he revealed his part in the scheme? There was no hesitation, no reluctance in his voice, almost as if he were too ready to give up his role in the crime. It was almost as though he was giving us exactly what we wanted, leading us down the path that he knew would eventually lead to his own unraveling. But that, my friend, was just another misdirection." Henri looked at him, still confused. "So you're saying Georges wasn't the real culprit?" Poirot shook his head. "No, Georges was a pawn, a necessary part of Lemoine's plan to buy time, to throw us off the scent. He confessed to everything, because Lemoine knew we would focus on him, allowing the real mastermind to slip away unnoticed." The realization hit Henri like a wave crashing against the shore. Lemoine knew all along we would chase Georges. He was never really the target, was he? "Exactly," Poirot replied. "Lemoine's role in the scheme was never as apparent as Georges. He orchestrated everything from the shadows, manipulating the people around him, knowing full well that the detective, myself of course, would follow the obvious clues, distracted by Georges' confession." Henri took a step back, his mind whirring as the pieces fell into place. "But why didn't we see it sooner?" Poirot's lips pressed together as he thought for a moment. "Because, Henri, we were looking in the wrong direction. The clues were all around us, hidden in plain sight. The subtle missteps in the story, the inconsistencies in George's actions, the timing of his confession, all of it pointed to one thing: Lemoine's manipulation." Henri's eyes widened. "And the tapestry?" "The tapestry," Poirot said, turning back to the piece that had started it all, "was the final stroke of genius. Lemoine used it as a symbol, an object of fascination that would distract us from the real game he was playing. The restoration, the historical inaccuracies, it all tied back to him. He needed that narrative protected. He needed people to focus on the tapestry's value, its importance, so that they wouldn't question the truth behind it." Henri's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So now what do we do? We have the truth. We know who he is. He can't just slip away." Poirot's face darkened, his eyes flashing with determination. "We'll bring him to justice, Henri, or we will try at least. But make no mistake, Lemoine will be prepared for our every move. He will not be caught easily." It was then that Henri heard the sound, soft at first, a faint buzz in his pocket. His phone. He reached for it quickly, eyes scanning the screen. His face went pale as he read the message. The colour drained from his face. "What is it, Henri?" Poirot asked. His voice calm, but there was an unmistakable urgency in his words. Henri didn't answer right away. His eyes widened, and his hand trembled as he held the phone out toward Poirot. It was a message from the police. They'd found something disturbing. Lemoine's office had been raided, but there was no sign of him. The walls were bare, the files gone. He had vanished. Not a trace. Poirot let out a deep sigh, the weight of the realization settling over him like a heavy fog. "He's gone," Poirot murmured. Just like that. Henri looked at him, his voice strained. But how? How did he do it? Poirot stood for a moment in silence, his mind working through the possibilities. Lemoine knew that the end was coming. He had planned his exit long before we ever uncovered the truth. He's always been one step ahead, always in control. Henri's frustration boiled over. So that's it? After all this, we don't get to see him pay for his crimes? Poirot's gaze hardened, and he shook his head slowly. Justice is not always as simple as we would like it to be, Henri. Sometimes the villain escapes. Sometimes the game ends with no victor. But rest assured, the truth is out. We know what he did. And that, well, that is a form of justice in itself. Henri stood there for a long moment, his face set in a grim line. The case was over, but the weight of the unanswered questions lingered like a shadow over the conclusion. The villain had escaped, leaving behind a trail of destruction and deceit. But Poirot had once again proven why he was the greatest detective of his time. In the end, it wasn't about capturing the villain. It was about understanding the truth, no matter how elusive, no matter how painful. Poirot stood in the dimly lit office, the flickering lights above casting long shadows on the floor. His mind was still working, still processing the twists and turns of the case. Henri stood beside him, his body tense with frustration, but even he couldn't ignore the sense of quiet awe that seemed to hang in the air. The case had been complex, intricate, yet in the end, it was nothing more than another chapter in the ongoing saga of human nature. Outside the office, the world continued to spin, indifferent to the chaos and brilliance that had just played out in this quiet corner of the city. The investigation was officially over, but Poirot knew there was more to it. There always was. Henri turned toward the door, breaking the silence. "So that's it, then? The case is closed." "Is it?" Poirot's voice was soft, his eyes still scanning the empty room, as though waiting for something else to reveal itself. "Perhaps, but I cannot shake the feeling that we are missing something. A small detail that has slipped through our grasp." Henri turned back, surprised by the detective's words. "What do you mean?" "We've solved it. Lemoine's gone. The truth is known. We know who's behind it all." Poirot raised a hand, a gesture of contemplation, before speaking again. "Yes, Henri, the surface of the case has been uncovered, but sometimes, my friend, the full picture lies beneath. The truth, while revealed, leaves behind echoes, ripples that continue long after the matter is settled." Henri frowned. "You're saying there's more to this?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is simply the nature of the mystery itself, the unsolved questions that linger even after the answers are given." For a moment, Henri remained silent. He wasn't sure what Poirot meant, but he had learned long ago that the detective's mind was always a few steps ahead. As much as he wanted to believe the case was finished, something in the way Poirot spoke made him doubt. There was no closure in the air, no finality. Poirot's gaze moved toward the corner of the room, where a single sheet of paper lay on the floor. It had fallen from the desk earlier, unnoticed in the heat of the investigation. Henri, too, noticed it now, the crumpled paper almost inconspicuous in its insignificance. Poirot reached for it, unfolding it carefully. Henri stepped closer, but his eyes widened when he saw what the paper contained. It wasn't a letter or a note. It was a map. A crude sketch, hastily drawn, marking what appeared to be a location deep in the countryside. The coordinates were scribbled beneath the map in a barely legible hand. It seemed out of place, unimportant, but Poirot's expression remained unreadable as he studied the map. Well, it seems we have another lead," Poirot murmured, his voice almost to himself. Henri's heart skipped a beat. "What is that? Where does it lead?" Poirot placed the map back onto the table, his fingers tracing the edges thoughtfully. "I do not know yet, Henri. But this map wasn't dropped here by accident. Someone left it for us to find. A subtle message, a clue hidden in plain sight." Henri's stomach turned. "You think this ties back to Lemoine?" "Perhaps," Poirot answered. "Or perhaps it is the work of someone else, someone who has been waiting for the right moment to step into the story." "But why leave it now?" Henri asked, his voice tinged with unease. "After everything we've uncovered, why would they want us to know this?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. He merely stared at the map, his mind processing the information, putting the pieces together. There was no rush, no immediate sense of urgency. The map was simply a part of the puzzle, waiting to be solved. Like all things in life, the answers would come in time. Henri sighed, the weight of the situation settling over him. "So we're not done then?" Poirot's eyes met Henri's with an intensity that made the young man pause. "No, Henri, we are never truly done. Not with mysteries. They have a way of revealing themselves piece by piece until we least expect it. And when that happens, we will be ready." Henri stared at the map again, his unease growing. It was so simple, so innocuous, but it carried with it the promise of another chase, another question, another mystery waiting to unfold. His mind raced, wondering who else might be out there, pulling strings from the shadows, and why they'd chosen now to reveal themselves. The unknown stretched out before him like a vast, dark horizon. Poirot's hand rested on the desk, his fingers lightly tapping the edge as he looked out the window. The rain had started to fall again, soft against the glass, a quiet reminder of how little the world had changed outside the walls of the investigation. The case had ended, but the detective knew, as he always did, that every answer led to new questions. "There is always more, Henri," Poirot said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "The mysteries never end. They only evolve, take on new shapes, new forms. What we see now is just a glimpse, a fragment. But the real truth, my friend, is still out there, waiting to be discovered." Henri swallowed hard, the weight of his mentor's words pressing down on him. He had thought that after so many cases, so many twists and turns, he'd finally understand what it meant to solve a mystery. But this felt different. The answer was never really the answer. It was merely the beginning of something larger, something even more elusive. Poirot turned and looked at Henri with a knowing smile. "Remember this, my friend. No case is ever truly closed. It only takes the right person, the right moment, and suddenly the mystery is reborn." Henri nodded slowly, his mind reeling, with the implications of what Poirot had said. The case was over, yes, but not in the way he had thought. There was something more, something hidden, waiting for them to find it. With one last glance at the map, Poirot turned toward the door. "Shall we go, Henri?" Henri hesitated for only a moment before following him, the door closing softly behind them. But as they stepped into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. No, it was only the beginning of a new mystery, one that would take them down a path they hadn't yet begun to understand. And so, as the investigation faded into the past, the lingering question remained, unanswered, ever present. The truth might be out there, but for the detective, the greatest mysteries were the ones that never truly revealed themselves. The case was solved, yet there was always more to uncover, more to understand, more to question. The pursuit of the answer, of the ultimate truth, was endless.